My guest at this time is Rob Henneke. He directs the Center for the American Future at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. He also argued for the repeal of the Affordable Care Act in federal court back in December. He joins me now to discuss the Trump Justice Department arguing that the law should, in fact, be repealed. And Rob, thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, I should say that the decision to your satisfaction came down in December. I'm not exactly sure when the case was argued, but what do you make of the Trump Justice Department now saying that it's essentially on your side in this fight and that it agrees that this law needs to be repealed?
Well, the Trump Department of Justice is doing its job to uphold the Constitution. The federal district judge who last year ruled that the Affordable Care Act was unconstitutional because of the individual mandate was correct. And if you read his opinion, it's based squarely upon the precedent set by the Supreme Court and the statute of the Affordable Care Act. And I commend the Trump administration, the Department of Justice, at looking at the reasoning of the court and choosing to defend the rule of law in now seeking to uphold a correct opinion.
One of the things that frustrated a lot of conservatives during the Obama administration was when the Justice Department, and the one that immediately comes to mind is defense of marriage, but I think there are one or two others, where the department simply decided it was no longer going to enforce the law. And the argument from conservatives was, that's not your job. If the law is going to change, it should either be struck down in the courts or, more appropriately, changed by the legislature. And since the Supreme Court has already weighed in a couple of times on this case, if you're going to flip that argument around now during the Trump years, the argument might be it's not the Justice Department's job to switch sides. Its job is to enforce the existing law. How do you respond to that?
I completely disagree with that. I mean, this duty to defend is a made-up doctrine from only the last couple of decades, and it's not the role of the Department of Justice to win at any cost. Their role is to seek justice and to uphold the Constitution. And so, in this situation, it's actually looking at what the Supreme Court that has already said. It's not them making up for themselves what they think the Constitution says. The Supreme Court in the first Obamacare case said the individual mandate was unconstitutional, but because that there's this shared responsibility payment that generates money for the federal government, we can avoid striking it down. Congress chose to zero out the shared responsibility payment. And so now the only thing that remains is the individual mandate, which the Supreme Court has already said is unconstitutional. So this is not DOJ inserting its opinion for what it thinks should happen. It's the DOJ dutifully following the law and looking at the court's opinion and saying, that's right.
We're talking with Rob Henneke of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And Rob, how does this change the fight now that the government is siding with the challengers?
So now, look, the way the case is postured is you have the Texas Public Policy Foundation, Texas Attorney General, and the Trump administration agreeing that the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional and should be struck down in totality. And on the other side, now you have a coalition of liberal states led by California and Nancy Pelosi and House Democrats being the ones who continue to champion this broken regulatory scheme called Obamacare, which has caused millions of people to lose their health insurance, caused millions to lose the choice of their doctor, and is causing rationing of care and lack of health care freedom. That's where they want to plant their flag. We want to provide for better health care outcomes by getting the federal government out of micromanagement of our daily health care choices.
I'm sure you've seen the reaction from a lot of folks on the left to the news that the Justice Department believes the law should be repealed. And the one that I've seen most common, and I'm sure you've seen it as well, is that, well, this just shows Republicans and conservatives weren't serious about protecting folks with pre-existing conditions who previously had some difficulty getting coverage. What's your response to that? And does there need to be a replace in place if the repeal actually happens?
That's a complete fallacy in terms that the only way to have persons with pre-existing conditions receive insurance coverage is if the federal government does it to them. I mean, really, to quote Benjamin Franklin, the comments coming out of Washington, D.C. just show, quote, how few there are who have courage. The reason you have people with pre-existing conditions is when they get priced out of coverage and aren't able to have insurance coverage, which the Affordable Care Act has driven up premiums by over 200% since the law was enacted in 2009. If we restore this back to the states, if we get rid of all of these regulations that are driving up the cost of health care, then we can get back to market-based policies that will be affordable. And yes, I think states should step in and guarantee that people don't fall through the cracks, but that's an appropriate thing for the states to lead on, not to say that one federal national healthcare regulatory scheme can be the only way to do so, because Obamacare has proven what happens and how bad the results are.
And that's an interesting point, because the status of where healthcare costs are now, as well as access and so forth, they've got a lot of folks who have coverage, quote unquote, but it's essentially through the Medicaid system. So what would it look like? What happens to folks' health care if, in fact, you win ultimately at the Supreme Court as soon as that decision comes down?
So what happens is health care continues to exist. Health insurance continues to exist, but in a way that's not micromanaged by the federal government. And where the path forward would be one, for states on a state-by-state basis to decide how they want to ensure guaranteed access to health care for those with pre-existing conditions, but to, in an ideal world, allow for a state-run regulatory scheme that allows people to choose the type of coverage and care that they want. And in many situations, people may want to only have a safety net type plan and instead, pay directly for a lot of healthcare needs. I mean, that's one option out there that would dramatically reduce costs. But this idea of socialized medicine, that we have to have one national one-size-fit-all type policy, doesn't work, is too expensive, and leads to people like the 2.6 million people who have had to drop their Obamacare plans because they can't afford them, being left out in the cold.
Where does this process stand right now? I mentioned that the District Court Judge Reed O'Connor issued his decision on your side in December. I know this is going to be a battle all the way up to the Supreme Court. When does this head back to a courtroom?
So we are at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. This Monday was when the sides defending Obamacare filed their opening briefs, and my opening brief will be due here approximately 30 days from now. And so, it'll all be fully briefed up. I expect it'll be argued before the appellate court sometime here this summer. And look who's siding with which sides. It's interesting how the big insurance companies are the ones that are coming in and filing briefs supporting Obamacare. I mean, if you want to talk about who has actually benefited under the Affordable Care Act, the only people you can really talk to about are the big insurance companies, which have had their profits skyrocket thanks to the bailouts from the government and the way that costs have increased. So it's going to be interesting to see how the sides align and really how the liberals and the big insurance companies are the ones who most want to make sure we keep Obamacare.
Fascinating to watch, and you are right on the front lines of it. Rob, thank you very much for your time today. We greatly appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for covering this important issue.
Rob Henneke directs the Center for the American Future at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. He also argued for the repeal of the Affordable Care Act in federal court and got a decision in his favor from that federal court back in December. As you just mentioned, the process has now begun at the Fifth Circuit as the appeal process takes place. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.